So we're jumping into our first of many Karpov games. Much like with Fischer, once the torch was passed in 1975 when Fischer refused to compete, then we have one of the all-time great players, Karpov, comes to the forefront. And we're going to take a look at a game from 1975 in the Soviet Team Championships. And we've got Karpov versus former world champion Boris Spassky. So, needless to say, Spassky was world champion before Fischer, so he should be taken seriously, right? And we're going to watch Karpov in classic Karpovian style just dismantle Spassky. And remember, as we discussed before the game, one of those bullet point facts you need to know about Karpov is, what's his style? What do we describe it? What type of animal?
Anaconda.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that boa constrictor. Just, get the squeeze going. He just squeezed you to death. And remember how we described that, because it's one thing to say he's got a boa constrictor style, but it's another thing to explain it. His pieces are all going to be better than his opponents, and his opponent's going to be in that, I've had somebody comment on this before on one of my videos, that zugzwang situation, where no matter what you do, your situation's going to get worse. His opponent lashes out, he punishes the mistake, and then he repeats the process, slowly but surely outplaying the person, accumulating small advantages to break his opponent, which is in deep contrast to Fischer's style, because Fischer blew up the board tactically or would sacrifice a pawn for initiative. Karpov was more of the game of inches type player. So let's dive right in. We've got Karpov playing white in a Queen's Indian defense. And it's a pretty standard position. Queen c2 is one of the many moves. Takes, catassels. And now, this just seems like a position. Looks similar to what we've studied before. Looks kind of like Catalan. And Karpov just plays a solid but simple move, because typically the natural pawn break for black in the position is playing c5. And when white takes, this rook is going to be on a good file where the action's happening. So this is one of those Karpovian prophylactic moves where he's just putting his pieces on good squares because he knows where the action is going to be happening later. Knight of 6. Since the knight moved, it left space behind. So Karpov jumps his knight into e5, and his bishop is now stronger, hitting the d5 pawn. Spassky decides to go for the natural pawn break, and we've got capture. And it's interesting because typically when I'm working with my students, and as we'll see in a classical hanging pawns position game that I'm going to show you that Karpov played, I teach my students typically that they want to play with the hanging pawns. And can we understand why it's called the hanging pawns? Because these two pawns are advanced and they have no brother pawn to protect them. So they're just out there hanging out. Okay? Something like bishop g5. And notice how all of white's pieces are aggressively placed. Knight d3, putting pressure on the hanging pawns. And once you force one to advance, you're threatening to capture. Red arrow. And notice how everyone is placing pressure. So it's as if magically all of Karpov's pieces will be better. So that didn't happen in the main game. Spassky decides to capture with the bishop, giving himself an isolated pawn. It's isolated, why? Because it's by itself. Yep. No other black pawn can come to defend it. It's by itself. That's why it's an isolated pawn. Yeah? So, knight d3, putting pressure on the bishop. If the knight can capture the bishop, white will have two bishops in an open position, a guaranteed advantage. Bishop f4. And a few moves happen here. He gets rid of the bishop, mostly because the bishop is on the square he needed for the knight. Now again we see this knight, the bishop, the rook. Everybody's eyeing the weakness. And notice what he did with e3. He's protecting the square so this pawn can't be pushed up. He's fixed the weakness. So black can only defend, where white's just going to slowly improve his position. I'm going to talk about that squeeze. That's what's happening. So he attacks the queen, and now queen a4, and we have a simple and effective double attack. Because if, for instance, black plays a waiting move here like h6, after captures, we have the exploitation of the pin. So Spassky, of course, has got to choose the lesser of two evils. He's got to defend his knight and loses the a7 pawn. But then, bolt from the blue, Spassky was trying to uncoordinate Karpov to go into this nasty sacrifice on f2. But the thing about a player like Karpov, he wants to be in control. If you take control away from him, do you think a world championship caliber player can't calculate well? Because if he has to, he's going to play what is necessary in the position. So he's got to get nasty. He's like, okay, let's get nasty. So, first of all, why can't we take the knight? And that's a good time to pause the video. King takes. And after rook c2, there's no way to avoid checkmate for white. So the knight is poison. We got to find something else here. So, knight takes d5. He defends the e-pawn while attacking the queen. So, bishop takes. Queen takes queen. And now, here's an example of what the engine liked here. It liked rook takes. And you pressure the pawn. And this is one of those classical positions where the bishop was better than the knight, and we traded down to this endgame. And this would be suicidal for black to go into, because these two pawns will march up the board effortlessly, just simply walking up the board. There's nothing the black rook can do to really stop it, and this is a win for white. In the main game, after queen takes, black plays knight takes d1. And now this next move, when I was looking at this game, it hit me right in the feels. Rook c1. The lady is poison. Takes. Mate. So I love this little like in-between move. I'm pretty sure this move was one of those, like, when he played it, Spassky had that oh crap moment. Now, here comes the pain. So he goes rook b8. Alright, we're just going to move our lady. And taking stock, so basically it's queen versus rook and knight. Queen f4, hitting the rook on b8. And he's not going to do much because he's not in a hurry. And that's one of the beautiful things about Karpov's style. So the rooks are the only thing that can hurt him, so let's trade off the rooks. There goes a rook. And now, this is how you use your advantages. You got 2-1 over here, meaning that as I advance my pawns, I'm guaranteed to have a passed pawn. If the knight and rook can't stop that pawn, or one of them has to sacrifice, the queen's going to be too strong for the remaining pieces, and he wins. So there we have our plan. So, queen b7. That is an awful ringtone. Could you silence it maybe? A4. Yeah, that's a good call, changing the ringtone. So, getting back to the game, notice exactly what I said was going to take place. Karpov is using his queenside pawn majority. He's got the 2 versus 1, and he's just advancing it to create a passed pawn and try to get another lady. Prophylaxis, the only thing black has to do is try to advance the pawns on the king side, so it's like, nah, I don't want you getting too much further over there. King G2, A5, now we've got our passed pawn. Pawns keep on moving forward. And after rook E7, Spassky had had enough after queen C6 check and king F3, because regardless of what happens here, bad things. I mean, even winning was in this position, just taking here and making a queen and going into this queen and rook ending. But it was more effort than being patient and taking the time to get to this position, because it is very difficult to see what black is supposed to do here. Mostly because we have a zugzwang position. The rook cannot move because you'll lose the knight. If the rook goes to D7, I take the rook. If the rook goes to, say, E8, I'll actually take the rook, and then I just make a second queen. So even though we had a winning continuation there, this looks so much cleaner and easier, and that's how Karpov does it. So hopefully you enjoyed the introduction on Karpov.